Thank you for listening to Reverberate, a Berean Bible Church podcast. We are continuing our Q&A series for Proverbs. Today's episode takes a more reflective turn. We're looking at Solomon, a man known for his wisdom, and asking how could he write so powerfully about godly relationships while living in a way that clearly contradicted that wisdom. 1 Kings 11 tells us his heart was turned away by many wives, leading him to idolatry. So how do we make sense of that? What does it mean to learn spiritual lessons from someone who ultimately failed to live out their faith? And how does Solomon's story help us think more clearly about guarding our own hearts? Let's get into it.
Changing gears a little bit, but a little bit on the same path is we have in Solomon an example of someone who maybe could have had more confession. I'm struck by the last verse is do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. The last verse of chapter 4. And then chapters 5, he really expands on this illustration of wisdom and folly being personified as marry wisdom, don't be tempted by the forbidden woman of folly. Someone pointed out in their question, this is the same Solomon in 1 Kings 11, and I'll read just a little passage. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to Yahweh his God, as was the heart of David his father. So we have a clear example. He did not abide by the wisdom that he had. He's teaching his sons, don't swerve to the right or left, guard your heart. And he has this illustration of marriage being turned away by women. So how do we rectify that? How can this be the same man that gave us Proverbs 5-7 when he lived this way in 1 Kings 11?
Yeah, it's one of the interesting questions from the wisdom literature specifically, because you say Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. This man gave us some pieces of scripture that God inspired, and yet we know his life. If I were writing this story, it would have been David writing all this stuff, not Solomon. But even David, you sit there and say, he had quite a few failings too. So that's one piece is we tend to assume if we're going to learn something about godliness, we're going to learn it from somebody who's spotless. That's true of Jesus, but it's not true of anybody else who wrote any book of scripture. So that fact is there. I think there's a lot of little pieces we can put with it that probably don't fully give us the solution we want, but I think they give us a good solution. One is that to know wisdom is not the same as walking in wisdom, and putting it into action is different. So if I look at Solomon and say he knew all this stuff, we're told towards the beginning of his life, and God says, what do you want? I'll give you anything you ask for. And at that point, his longing was for wisdom. He said, I have this task before me that is way too great. I cannot be the king of such a great people, so I need wisdom. I need to know the patterns of creation so that I rule in a just and good way. Like, we know that's where he started. And clearly, because scripture tells us he's the wisest person to walk the earth, he clearly knows God's wisdom, yet he didn't walk in that wisdom at the end of his life. And that's a challenge for us. It's something for us to remember. Just because biblical wisdom doesn't mean you're actually walking in it. I think another thing it's fascinating to me, we assume that Solomon wrote this as an older person. And we assume, therefore, because that's how we think of wisdom, right? We think if somebody's going to write their Proverbs, we don't look to the 12-year-old writing it. We look to somebody who's lived some life experience. But if Solomon had supernatural wisdom given to him, he might have been 20 writing these things down and then later fallen away. So when he wrote Proverbs 5 and 6, I highly doubt he was looking out at 700 wives and 300 concubines at that moment. I think that was probably a different time frame, which again reminds us just because you knew wisdom and walked in it once doesn't mean you will always know it and walk in it. And so he calls you. In fact, one of the Proverbs later says that if you cease to hear instruction, if you cease to hear wisdom, you will turn away. And he knew that, but apparently at the end of his life, he did cease to hear. So you could tie that. This text, 1 Kings 11, brings up love multiple times. It says he loved many foreign women. It says he clung to these in love. It says they turned away his heart. So again, intellectually knowing and truly loving wisdom are not necessarily the same thing. It also says his heart was not wholly true. And I think it's a little bit scary to think Solomon could have all this wisdom and yet could have that be the end of his life. Thankfully, what he tells us, what Scripture tells us, is that the solution is fairly simple. Keep turning to God and hearing. Keep listening. Don't cease to hear wisdom. Keep your heart turning towards him so that instead of being divided where Solomon's heart wasn't wholly true to God, it was partly clinging to these foreign women, which wasn't just wives, that was also foreign women who were idolatrous women. So it was clinging not only to the person, but clinging to their idolatry and their loves. So the answer is reasonably simple for us. This danger exists. So therefore, keep your heart coming to be wholly towards God. Guard your heart, which we just talked about, from other loves that would steal you away. Come in humility so that we're always coming like Solomon. God, I have this task that is far too great for me. I need your wisdom. That's how he started. We don't really know what his prayers were like at the end of his life, but I highly suspect they didn't sound like that.
It is interesting. The message is the same, but is it interesting to think of if this came from, if he wrote this at the end of his life or at the beginning, because it colors either it's an old man with a life of regret trying to get his sons to not follow in his footsteps, or like you said, it's a young man who's been given supernatural wisdom and then he turns away. By the way, it is a sobering reminder of loving God and having that be your focus.
I also want to say that I think we got to remember that God's providence is involved. And so he has providentially allowed a man who the scripture clearly attributes this kind of wisdom to, right, to fall and to end his life the way he did. And so I think that it actually serves Proverbs. It makes it so much more powerful because we have an embodiment of both the positive and the negative. We have in Solomon himself, we have that. Just think about how providentially that actually serves our understanding, where you can not just be somewhat wise compared to your friends, you can be the wisest person walking the face of the earth. And it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily well. And what does that confirm? That confirms the teaching of Proverbs, that it's not just, wisdom is not just, I'm going to open this box called wisdom, I'm going to walk through this door one time called wisdom. It is a journey. It is a path. And it's reiterated over and over again.
It's a little bit of a side point, but this is helpful to hear from me because I think we all have examples of people that we've loved and we've learned from and have helped shaped us in some way spiritually. And then we see that person fall in whatever way. And often that can it can feel like that taints my learnings from that person. If he couldn't hold on to this, is what he said even true? And what does that mean for my faith? But this is helpful that we have, like I said, a clear example of someone who was called the wisest man that's ever walked the earth, still falling.
Thank you again for joining us on Reverberate. As we reflect on Solomon's life, we're reminded that knowing wisdom is not the same as walking in it. His story is a sobering call to keep our hearts anchored in love for God, not just knowledge about him. Next time, we'll continue exploring the heart by asking some tough but important questions. Are we obeying God out of genuine love, or are we just trying to look righteous? What's really driving our obedience? We'll hope you join us again as we keep seeking God's wisdom together.